We were just talking about what other topics our audience of mid to senior level HR leaders might appreciate hearing from. And I think we landed on productivity and efficiency, really headcount impacts in the age of AI. Would you frame it up any differently?
And I think the trigger for it is we're now seeing in the headlines a lot of reductions in force. And it's the first time in a few years that I think that the headlines have been coming and seem to be coming faster of thousands of jobs, especially in tech, especially for the reasons of AI, being named as the reason for it. What do we make of it? Is this just PR to blame AI for all of these headcount reductions? Or is this actually technology really is allowing companies to do so much more?
I don't know if being outside any of those organizations will ever really be able to tell. But I guess for the audience, here's what at least I'm reacting to. There was a big announcement at Oracle earlier this week, and we're the last week of April 2026 right now, where Oracle announced that they were cutting more than 20,000 jobs. They're a big company. That's not a giant percentage of their workforce, but that's a lot of jobs. That's on top of the Meta layoff announcements, Disney, Microsoft. Lots of big employers have been announcing lots of staff reductions. And I think we heard kind of the same thing, that a lot of founders and senior leaders at these smaller companies are looking for efficiencies. What can AI do where we don't need to hire someone, where we may not even need some of the people that we have today? That's compounded, in my memory anyway, by some of the chatter from NVIDIA's CEO, Jensen Huang, who talked about his 60 direct reports. And then I'm pulling up another article here that says Airbnb CEO Brian Chesky at one point had 40 to 50 direct reports. So the span of control, meaning number of direct reports, especially at the CEO layer, that seems to be as in vogue as the 996 is nowadays. Not only are we sprinting and working really, really hard in startup land and in tech in general, but there's also this great flattening of fewer layers in organizations.
Yeah. And I think you're pulling together a few things that we're hearing about right now of we can do a lot more with AI, which means each individual can do more. So smaller teams, which means less people are needed. We have a flattening of the organization so that we don't need to have so many layers of management and control happening. This trend that Jensen has started, which in him sharing his own practice that works for him and his management style and the team that he has in place, has inspired a number of leaders that I've talked to who are like, should I have more direct reports? I actually had a CEO client come to me just last week and say, I have 17 direct reports right now. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And that's a tough question to answer because traditionally you're like, you kind of want a 6-to-1 ratio if you're going to actually have one-on-ones and career discussion, all that. But at the same time, CEOs are kind of these unique managers for many organizations and what their actual managerial skills are and how good they are at it. And the question I posed to this founder at the end of the day was, is it working for you in your organization?
I have a point of view on this. And often I'll default to the answer is it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on if it's working for you. However, I cannot imagine a scenario under which 60 actual direct reports is efficient and effective, whether you have one-on-ones or not. The fact that Jensen says, well, I'll just contact somebody when I need them, that sounds ridiculous to me. Jensen, feel free to drop into my DMs if you want to debate this. Like I connect that back to stories I hear of Google's early days where Larry and Sergey were reviewing new hire candidate packets for every single hire. That's ridiculous. And they already had thousands of employees. If you cannot set up systems and empower mid-level leaders to make decisions that you probably don't need to make. And of course, talent is important, but should you be involved in your 3009th hire directly and looking at their CV? I can't imagine that that makes sense. And same deal, Jensen, I'm glad you have such an amazing product. I think this is an example of some organizations have such a great product or service that it doesn't matter what ridiculous management practices they have. Their organization is going to be successful in spite of these ridiculous management practices. But I also think that it attracts attention and it leads to questions from earlier stage leaders at earlier stage companies that are trying to replicate what successful orgs are doing. And I guess this is just another one of those cases in my mind where I'd say like a best practice at one place might actually be really dangerous for you. And it's not about how smart you are and how hard you work. It's actually about what's most effective managing an org, leading a team. And sometimes there are just those unique situations where the product or service is such a rocket ship that it doesn't matter how ridiculous you manage your org.
Well, I also think that the way that people systems are set up, it is a system. They are connected. And so if you only have one part of somebody else's system in place without the other pieces, that's what makes it so dangerous because your feedback loops might not be appropriate. You might be growing negative feedback to carry the analogy further. Jensen probably has direct reports that have lots of experience in what they're doing. They
Sure.
probably have worked with him for a longer period of time than average. They probably have some sort of proactive reporting that's going up to him so that he sees what's going on and knows where to dive in. I'd also love to talk to a few of these people who report into him of like, what does that actually feel like and look like? And kind of what's the mindset you need to have if you are one of 60 direct reports?
He might think it's effective, but the rest of the org might be like really struggling under that lack of contact and seagull style management where you swoop and you poop and you don't really understand what's going on because you don't have enough context.
Exactly. I think if we bring back in the AI layer into this, Andrew,
Yeah.
what's the part that suddenly makes some of this ridiculous stuff seem realistic or normal or somehow feasible? Are people crazy to think that AI somehow allows you to have more direct reports effectively or to be able to review more and more, swoop and poop things like Larry and
Yeah.
Sergey's resume reviews?
That's such a good question, which is like what actually works and what can people really apply and learn from? I agree that technology is advancing and we can do more faster. AI and other types of AI enabled technology are enabling us to communicate better, faster, coach better, faster, communicate. I think it's realistic to imagine that you can do more with less. But massive swings from moving from a org with maybe 6 direct reports to 60 would require massive changes in how you operate. And again, I would really pressure test that and say, I don't think that's realistically effective and sustainable over time. Yeah, I've seen all sorts of really interesting AI coaching tools. Laszlo Bach with Humu, this is 10 years ago, had a system. It wasn't really AI, it was just nudges, behavioral nudges to do certain things. I think that was a nice tool. But realistically, does that move you from X direct reports to 3X direct reports? I can't imagine how something like that could. And hey, we're chasing capital efficiency. The promise of AI for most orgs is, again, productivity and efficiency and do more with less. And so they're trying to realize that. Private equity investment firms that I work with are trying very hard to articulate what are we doing, what value is it creating, share that back with LP investors and the funds to rationalize, hey, work with us because we create more value from using these tools that these portfolio companies otherwise wouldn't do. Same thing with founders that are venture backed. You get one big check, kind of varies how big it is, $5, $10 million in a Series A, maybe more if you're a rocket ship AI company nowadays. But that's what you got. And so you got to hit your milestones, you got to hit your product roadmap, you got to hit your revenue goals. And so it's not crazy to try to do more with less and to explore it. But how far and how fast we're pushing the boundaries, I think, is the question. And a lot of these leaders could, frankly, put their companies at risk if they push too hard. Something will break.
And I think it's important what you're calling out with the investor pressure that's happening
Yeah.
is that they are seeing, hey, there's an opportunity. You all should be more productive. And that pressure from the investor set is very real, very strong, and is coming through CEOs, founders, leaders across the board. And it is driving so much of this intensity in both work hours as well as in this idea that we can be far, far more productive. I think there is a trickiness in that some of the cuts we are seeing are cuts that most companies would make anyway, regardless of whether it was AI or some other tool coming in. As an employee, I have to imagine that the incentive to become so AI-ified in your job is almost getting inverted. Why do I want more AI in my job if that just means they're going to lay off half my team or a quarter of my team? And so I think that part of it is tricky in this narrative that's being spun right now of all employees should want to learn AI and figure out how to weave it into their work, both because it makes hopefully some of their work better, easier, more consistent, but also because many of these companies that are laying employees off are still hiring. I have seen organizations where essentially they're letting go of the people who aren't embracing AI and replacing them with people who have.
The word I might bring into this conversation is opportunistic. So layoffs and cost reductions, opportunistic. You're trying to improve the bottom line. And a lot of these big tech companies are still wallowing in headcount that exploded on the back end of COVID, where there was just mass hiring and people were kind of all over the place. There may be a linkage to tariffs and price increases as well. Tariffs hit the news, they happened. Lots of organizations that may not have actually been affected by tariffs used that opportunistically to raise their prices. That's not crazy. That often makes good business sense to try to link it to something bigger. But I think you're right. You're taking advantage of the situation on a macro level, even if it hasn't directly forced your hand at your own org.
I think this is an evolving story that we are in the midst of how is AI helping and hurting in business generally, and specifically in our worlds where we're seeing these PE-backed and VC-backed companies navigating through the pressures that are coming from the funding models that they have, needing to be able to perform. And then how do you navigate through that effectively as a leader?
And it strikes me that a lot of these organizations, especially venture-backed tech, are strongly encouraging, and that might be a generous way of saying it, team members to experiment with AI and build something and find a way to use this, to find a way to make it game-changing for our org. And the 996 culture is creeping in. And for those that are under a rock and don't know what that means 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., 6 days a week. That is intensity and that is pace. And frankly, that's something that tech startups used to be known for. And then, times were really good and people, I think, got fat and happy. And there's been a reversion. Anyway, the idea about just be curious, just experiment, figure out a way to work with this really often leads to a whole lot of unproductive activity. And it's often fear-based. I have to show something that I'm doing. I've seen some really silly workflows. I'm going to send an automated message on the 3rd anniversary of somebody's hire date to everybody. Is that game-changing? Does that move the needle in any way? Absolutely not. There are other ways, I'm sure, that can be discovered. Coding is much faster, content marketing, the volume goes up, and question mark around quality. But this idea of the push to just be curious and just experiment, the linkage back to AJ's conversation is, let's be clear about what we're trying to solve for. Let's design some clear experiments and test whether we can actually make an impact on that thing that we're trying to move, whether it's product roadmap or revenue or something else. And I guess I'd encourage organizations to try to be as focused as possible on what experiments you're going to run rather than just kind of blast out this frenzy of activity, play with AI.
I think this is one we are on the same page. It's too vague to just say play with AI. And the parallel that I've been drawing is it's a tool. It's a very, very cool tool with lots and lots of things that we're still exploring, and it continues to evolve. It's effectively like handing someone a hammer and say, go hammer a bunch of things. And when you bang on it, see what gets fixed. And instead, what we have is not a hammer. We have a very sophisticated, 76-piece Swiss Army knife that keeps getting more features added to it that we're trying to figure out. But even then, when you have a Swiss Army knife, you kind of have to know, am I going to whittle this piece of wood? Am I trying to unlock this door? What are we solving for first? And I'm brought back to actually the early days of when I first started in people leadership. And we were looking for HR tools, what to put in our stack. This was around the time when I think it was even pre-Lattice, but like, is it a culture amp or what do I want my payroll system to be? And
Well, and you were at Gusto back in the days. You were part of the stack. Yeah.
exactly. And the question, I actually would force my team, and thankfully they were bearing with me, but I would force my team for many tools before we invested in them to say, hey, let's do it with Google Sheets and basic tools to glue something together. Because what I wanted to understand is what's the process? What's the thing we're trying to solve for? Where are the kinks? What are the options that we want if we were to able to design this ourselves? And then we'll go and find a tool and see if it can do all the things that we need, because you want to solve the problem first, figure out what is that problem definition, and then go and find a solution for it. But right now it feels backwards. Like I've been talking to people about like when Excel first came out, I have to imagine that people were like, oh, this is so cool. Let me think about how I can use it. But it'd be so weird today if your manager was like, make sure to use Excel today. Are you using Excel? Is Excel happening?
Yes.
How about a calculator? Have you used a calculator yet? Once we know the tools, you just kind of expect people to know when to use them. And because we're in the midst of being educated on how to use this tool, we don't know when to use AI. And so we come back to, okay, please define the problem that we're trying to solve. And then, oh, by the way, can AI be used for this should be the second thought, not the first thought. I've even seen guidance where people are saying, before you try to do anything yourself, try to use AI for it. But I do think it is a tension that I'm seeing in terms of when and how do we use AI.
I guess if I were to pose a couple of scenarios or pathways, one is use AI for everything, experiment on your own time, and you build stuff and you learn a lot along the way. Other path would be, hey, you've got a job to do. Mail needs to be delivered, the payroll needs to run, like whatever it is needs to happen. And generally, especially if you're a leanly staffed organization, you don't have a ton of flex in your team to just play with stuff that is going to take some ramp time. I think path number two is maybe there's one person dedicated or a small team or a third-party vendor consultant that identifies concrete practical use cases. And heck, maybe that turns into a form of SaaS at some point. But if there's some sort of semi-packaged, productized use case, then your org can use it. And maybe you build it yourself, maybe you buy it from whoever built it, but that's less flailing and more executing.
Yeah, it's reminding me of something Colleen McCreary, who's currently at Confluent, had mentioned with her team. They came up with a list. I think it was called like the BS list or something. It was a bunch of stuff that was annoying the team that ideally we'd like to fix, but like no one has time or space for. And then with AI, what they were doing was going through this list with a very specific goal in mind of how to get rid of this BS that was happening in the organization to be able to try to use it to solve. I like the specificity of that. I think the use case element is something I've talked with my clients about pretty regularly, of rather than just this broader mandate around AI or even setting expectations of how much AI to be using, is to start with, here are a few use cases of things that we'd love to be able to solve this quarter or this year. And let's see how we can solve that. Let's understand the problem, see if AI can be applied here, and then go for it. I'm curious your take, Andrew, on I've been seeing lately companies where they're thinking, hey, I just want to replace a vendor. So like, let's vibe code our new compensation management system. I had somebody say, could I vibe code Workday so that I don't need Workday anymore? To all the challenges that come with Workday, I was like, I don't know if I would be vibe coding a Workday replacement right now. And so I'd love your take on, how much could you be able to do right now with these AI technologies, and how quickly, if you were in the seat right now, would you be thinking about, would I be replacing things and trying to build it ourselves? And how to even think about that problem?
All right, so I'm speaking from a place of a failed SaaS founder where I spent several years and several $100,000 trying to build a performance management technology that used AI transcription and summaries, and then feeding that through an LLM to give senior leaders insight into how their org is performing. And it didn't take off. And we were coding before vibe coding existed. And I mothballed it. I mothballed it in part because I started playing around in Make and in Lovable. And I started trying to build what I had developers and engineers creating. When I was vibe coding, looked better immediately, was easy enough for me to edit that I felt like I could make, as a non-technical founder, I could make more progress faster. But I really ran into some hitches connecting it to a back end, making sure that the wiring really worked. It looked good, but it didn't do the stuff that I needed it to. And I wasn't able to complete the last mile of it. And I've heard that story time and time again, where HR leaders that are a little more technical than I am, like Q Hamarani talks about what he coded over the weekend. And invariably, he gets it pretty far, then he tends to hand it off, as do other people, to like actually make the thing work. It takes 80% of the time to do that last part of it. So this is a very long answer to the idea that I think the more complicated the system and the more sensitive the information and processes that you're working in, probably the less likely it makes sense for you to build it yourself, because there are just so many layered risks to it. There's something about the quality and trust, and you know it's going to be good if you go to an established provider that's done the same thing hundreds or thousands of times versus making it yourself for something, again, that is complex or sensitive. I might lower the bar and say, if there's something pretty simple, like sending happy anniversary emails or commenting on LinkedIn posts or publishing a blog based off of some subject matter that you have a repository for, I think AI could be really useful. There's still a place for experts, maybe more now than ever.
I like that synthesis of those two criteria, like how complex is it and how sensitive is the information? Because building that part of it right now, at least at this moment in end of April 2026, is still tough to figure out that last mile for sure. But certainly there are a bunch of things that are fun and easy to be able to spin up, and way easier than it would have been 6 months ago or 12 months ago.
Here's a really simple example. I'm an old man tennis player, and I put together a league in the winter for a bunch of other old men to play each other. And we have this Excel spreadsheet that identifies your ladder ranking, and it moves around so that you know who to play week to week. And could I go vibe code something like that in Lovable or any one of another ton of different tools? Yeah, probably. But I also could do a Google search and find something that somebody else has already put together that is fit for purpose. And guess which one is faster? And guess which one is more likely to work right away? And if my goal is less to learn and experiment and more to get a solution to my problem, I'd rather just go get the thing. And I found a couple of free versions. I found a couple of low, like $19 versions where you could download somebody else's Excel spreadsheet that like sets up your matches. And I paid for one. There's an analogy here to how you use AI. There's still a place for makers, and you don't need to do everything yourself. It might still be better, faster, cheaper to acquire it.
I think we're actually aligned on this, which is interesting. I was wondering if we would be. Then maybe we revisit this in a year, because the technology is moving so fast that the answers are shifting. I'm in alignment. I would not be trying to get my team to be vibe coding a Workday replacement right now. I mean, even just the cost of your team's time to be able to do something like that to the level and degree that you would need from a complexity and a security standpoint, I think is not yet worth the ROI.
Jess, great conversation. Hopefully it's useful for some members of our audience. We're still exploring. The technology continues to advance, just like you said. So we should revisit again.
Sounds good. I'll see you here in a year.